If there is one thing most of us can universally agree we enjoy across all anime, it's a good fucking fight, of which Sword Art Online has in no short supply. So, I finally took the time to consider just which are my favourite fights, and why are they my favourite fights? What is the criteria? Should I value narrative importance and the weight behind the context of the fight? Or just purely how amazing the fight looks visually and that in turn makes my brain go, holy shit! It was really hard to decide, and I was actually struggling for quite some time. So, in the end, I actually took some advice that Shu gave Raku and Nizukoi. When I close my eyes, what are the fights that immediately come to the forefront? The ones that my mind naturally drifts back towards again and again, with all the feelings of excitement and awe that I felt on the first time experiencing them. And thus, the following is the conclusion that I finally arrived at. In 5th place, which may be the last slot on my list, but by no means does that devalue this incredible fight, is Kirito vs Death Gun. So let's just start with the obvious. I think low-key this might be one of the most pleasing fights to the eye in the anime. It just looks so fucking good and moves so smoothly. It accurately depicts how overwhelmed Kirito is feeling in this fight, but not only that, it's fairly tactical as well. Death Gun is the speed type and fights in a similar manner to how we see Asuna do, overwhelming the opposition with very fast and precise thrusts in multiple succession. So, playing to his strengths, he has Kirito on the back foot for nearly the entirety of the fight, completely blitzing him. Kirito is desperately struggling to keep up and it's taking everything he has just to prevent himself from giving a fatal opening to Death Gun. This isn't just because of the stylistic matchup, but also because Kirito hasn't been diving into full dive to the hardcore extreme extent he was before since the events of Fairy Dance. While in contrast, Death Gun has been practicing pretty much every waking moment in GGO for this tournament. So sensing the skill gap, Death Gun sees that Kirito's leg is pretty much free as he is barely keeping up defensively, resulting in him landing this clean sweep causing Kirito to fall on his ass. Now, Kirito does do a pretty good job of fighting from his back and manages to get to his feet again. However, he is very painfully aware that this fight is not going his way at this point. So I think at least he makes a tactical adaptation to try and leverage the one advantage he does have: physical strength. Getting Death Gun into a position where he has no choice but to block a heavy overhead strike from Kirito. This forces a blade lock. In this, Death Gun cannot move or use his speedy blade work that has so far given him the advantage in this fight. In a blade lock, the one who is physically stronger comes out ahead in almost every scenario, as the blade lock itself becomes essentially an arm wrestle. If you can manage to push the locked blades into your opponent's body, then obviously that can cause potentially fatal damage. I thought it was a really cool idea for Kirito to both immobilize and potentially score a win against Death Gun here by leveraging his advantage and strength. But unfortunately for Kirito, Death Gun did not give in so easily to this tactic and somewhat easily evaded the situation by rolling backwards and kicking Kirito off him. But by now I hope I have sold you on how awesome this fight is visually and in terms of how it plays out. But that's not the only cool thing about it. Narratively, this fight also continues to stick out in my mind. One of the main prevailing themes of Sword Art Online is the concept of real strength, and that theme is especially prevalent in the Phantom Bullet arc. It's so cool that I actually made a whole video about it where I explored the meaning of strength through the eyes of Kirito and Sinone. So if you want more details on that, feel free to check it out. But for this duel, in the context of this video, the relevant part is that Kirito is not a fearless, courageous warrior with absolute confidence in himself going into it. In fact, just the idea of facing Death Gun and by extension the trauma of the darker parts of SCO was so terrifying to him at a point that when Sinone saw him during the lobby racked by this fear, it reminded her of what she looked like when she was suffering through an episode of her PTSD. The whole of this arc, Sinone is desperately trying to gain strength in order to overcome her PTSD. But when she is shown that that strength she thought she was attaining was just an illusion, her hopes for ever getting over her PTSD were all but shattered in that instant. But after seeing Kirito, who was dealing with demons of his own and could relate to her struggle, he shows her with this fight what real strength is. It's not the banishing of fear. Fear will always be there in some form. It's about the will to keep moving forward and act despite of it. And through this display of Kirito valiantly moving forward to face his demons, despite even being outmatched by them in this instance, he inspires Sinone and opens her eyes up to her own path of moving forward. And that, I think, is just fucking beautiful. Up next in 4th place in my list is Asuna vs the Devilman himself, POH. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why Asuna vs POH and not Kirito vs POH? I mean, this fight didn't even last that long. But bear with me, give me a chance to explain. Firstly, this whole part of the arc I was really impressed with Asuna. She was such a trooper, held the line for so long against insurmountable odds. Now in this fight, despite being beaten, battered, and her body completely numb from exhaustion, with everyone around her collapsed, she still finds the strength to stand once more and try to prevent a potential tragedy. It was really awe-inspiring and awesome to witness, but that is not the primary reason why I love this fight so much. You see, as you guys may or may not know, my favourite character of all time is Yuki. That's right, not just in SEO, but of all time in all anime. When she died in Mother's Rosario, it tore my heart asunder, and to this day is one of the closest times I've ever come to crying at media. To give me my favourite character of all time and then to kill her in the same arc was very cruel indeed. But she elevated my love for Asuna even more and left her with the prized original sword skill and Yuki's ultimate technique, Mother's Rosario. Ever since then, I had been greatly anticipating seeing Asuna using the technique, honouring Yuki's memory and showing that in a way she still lives on within Asuna, but she never did use it. Granted, we didn't get to see Asuna very much in ALO post obtaining Mother's Rosario, as that's when Asunization started, so maybe she did use it off screen sometime, but nevertheless it did sadden me as it seemed like we would never get a chance to see her use it. At the time, Asunization was in the middle of the arc where Kirito and Hyujo ascended the church. I, and I'm sure many at the time, thought that the Asunization arc would come to a close once they successfully conquered the church. I did not foresee Asuna entering the underworld, and even when she did, since she was using a Wrath mid super account and not her Asuna ALO account, I presumed it was not possible to use the Mother's Rosario skill, as it's an OSS and not part of SEO's base skills that were featured in the underworld. So as you can imagine, I was completely shocked when I read the text, "Thank you, Yuki." No fucking way was the immediate thought that crossed my mind. Then she does it. She activates Mother's Rosario. I want you to picture me in this moment. Like 16 years old or some shit, at like 2 AM at night reading this and completely losing my shit, taking every fibre of my being not to just scream in joy and pure bliss at what I had given up on happening finally happening. Had I not been living with my parents at the time, I may have just shouted for even the heavens to hear how happy I was in this moment. Asuna rips into POH and completely destroys him. Had it not been for his bullshit knife, he would have certainly met his end there and there. Years later, I finally got to see that moment animated in the anime and it did not disappoint. It looks absolutely beautiful and did such a climactic moment for me more than justice. If I was the sort of person that could cry at media, that may have done it. So now you're probably thinking, wow, that was very passionate. If that's only number 4, then what could number 3 possibly be? And the answer to that question would be Hyujo versus Broccoli. What I loved about this fight is it felt like the result was an accumulation of Kirito's influence on Hyujo. You see, Kirito isn't always necessarily the strongest, most skilled, or even the most well-equipped combatant in a fight he finds himself in. Examples being in his fights against both Eugene and Yuki. But he is almost always the most creative of the fighters participating. He excels at thinking outside of the box and coming up with crazy solutions for most of the situations he finds himself in. Like when he used a combination of the sun and a second sword to score a win against Eugene, or when he utilized a sword skill to intercept magic attacks when holding off the front line from reaching the sleeping knights. This approach and mindset is a skill that has always given Kirito an edge and is probably one of his greatest assets. As such, throughout Asunization he has continually tried to teach this way of thinking to Hyujo, to not just agree to a straight-up gentleman's fight in which everything is conventional and obvious, to instead use your imagination and creative thinking to find paths to victory where you would otherwise lose if fighting conventionally. And this fight was such a brilliant showcase of Hyujo truly succeeding as Kirito's pupil in an awesome display of this mindset, allowing him to completely outplay Broccoli despite being severely outmatched by leveraging the whole battlefield to his advantage in a creative application that Broccoli could not anticipate. It was so fucking satisfying to see, and I still remember how proud I felt of Hyujo in this moment when I read it originally. It truly felt like he had proved himself in this fight, that he did not need Kirito to carry him, he had learned well and could stand evenly with Kirito. Also, as a side note, from the arc of Kirito and Hyujo's ascension of the church, this is probably the most well-adapted fight in the anime. It looks beautiful and I feel like they did a really good job of conveying the creativity of Hyujo's win. And just like that, there were 2. So which fight is the one that took second in my rankings of the SCO fights? The answer to that being Kirito, Hyujo and Alice versus Quinella. So just right off the bat, whenever I think of this fight, I do smile before curling up in a ball and crying myself to sleep, as this was the first time since childhood the three of them had been truly reunited, side by side as allies. Just this reunion in and of itself was truly heartwarming, as it was such a journey to get to this point. For this was pretty much the primary reason that Kirito and Hyuga had gone through everything that they did, with the hopes of meeting Alice again and reuniting. In fact, I still use a screenshot of this reunion from the anime as my desktop wallpaper, as I just love this moment that much. So you can understand what followed was completely and utterly heartrending. This whole ascension of the church arc had been completely unpredictable. Kirito and Hyuga had a plan going into it, and nearly nothing went according to it. Kirito used his dagger to save Fanatio, Hyuga still had his as they were unable to use it on Alice due to her just completely destroying them in the opening of that battle pretty much. Luckily, Kirito and Alice did bond during their time, narrowly escaping death by climbing the outside of the tower, so she was there to help them, but then Hyuga subsequently lost his dagger in a blunder against Quinella, so now Cardinal couldn't help them as they had planned. That was a huge blow, as Cardinal was the only one who could realistically match Quinella in strength. Kirito and Hyuga were just meant to support her. So at this point, I had no idea what was going to happen. Was it even possible for them to overcome this near godly being? Well, maybe now that the three of them were reunited, they could prevail somehow. But boy was I fucking wrong, lol. It was a complete disaster. Before even getting the chance to fight Quinella, the three of them were utterly rendered completely powerless by her death robot. It wasn't even close, they had no chance. I was completely shocked. Kirito was even bisected. It seemed like maybe Alicization would just end here, after all of that, with them meeting a tragic end. But luckily Cardinal did expose herself and save them. But then she also tragically met her end at the hands of Quinella. Hyuga sacrificed himself in a beautifully tragic final attack, and even that wasn't enough to bring Quinella down. Alice was also taken out of the fight whilst protecting Hyuga. This truly was the toughest opponent Kirito had ever faced to this day in my opinion. Sure, you can argue that Gabriel was maybe stronger, but Kirito himself was also stronger. The gap between him and Gabriel was much closer than the gap between him and Quinella, making this the vastly harder fight in my opinion. It truly felt completely doomed. It took everything he had and then some to just barely come out victorious in this battle. And even that victory had only been possible to achieve due to Quinella's arrogance, basically. And honestly, could you even call it a victory? It had cost them so much. Hyuga had died, something I never thought would happen. I was completely shocked and shared the pain in Kirito's heart after watching him die, as over the course of the great journey that was Alicization, you really do become fond of him and his friendship with Kirito. Kirito himself had lost his first truly complete, pure friendship, his arm and then his mind as a result of this. Alice had to deal with the fact that everything she had ever known and believed in was basically a lie, as well as the fact that she was an existence that shouldn't have happened and came at the cost of the true Alice. It was truly a battle that was completely unpredictable and one that had me on the edge of my seat whilst reading it the whole time. One in which the odds seemed completely insurmountable and one in which great consequences were suffered. For that, I will always remember it as honestly one of the greatest peaks of the franchise. So now that just leaves us with number 1, which is the fight that stands atop all the other excellent ones in my mind. Let me know if you guys managed to guess it correctly in the comments. I will honestly be surprised if you did, as the fight that is my favourite out of all the ones the series has produced so far is Asuna vs Yuki. Just to start with, Yuki is my favourite character of all time, so any fight she is in I'm going to naturally like more. But that's not the only reason I like this fight. I think it was an excellent way to introduce us, the audience, to the absolute strength of Yuki. The fight is told through Asuna's perspective, and like us, she has no real idea of how strong Yuki truly is. All she knows is what her friends told her, and she has no reason to not believe them obviously, so she knew she had to be quite strong at least, but she couldn't know how strong she was exactly until she faced Yuki herself. At the very least, much like the reader, before the fight takes place, she was doubtful that there was a person that even Kirito couldn't challenge. But that doubt was instantly dispelled after Yuki completely and effortlessly outplays Asuna in the opening exchange. I will always remember Yuki's smile of absolute confidence and belief in her abilities during this whole exchange. What an absolute legend. From there, it actually turns into quite a tactical fight from Asuna's end. Fitting, as she is a smart cookie. She knew that from that opening exchange and the exchange that followed, there was no way that she could gain the upper hand in a straight up fight, so she tried to leverage the one advantage she knew she probably did have in an attempt to essentially cheese the win, that advantage being experience. She could tell that Yuki more than likely wasn't that experienced in a player versus player duel, as her fighting style was very honest. There was no attempts at deceit or trickery to upset the balance of the fight and create a window of opportunity. She has essentially been winning by being just straight up better than all her opponents. But Asuna had a wealth of experience from both Aincrad and ALO in player duels, and with that experience, she concluded that Yuki more than likely would not see this cheese coming. She created a situation in which the two of them would be locked in a close quarter fight, and when Yuki parried one of her strikes, Asuna went for a punch to the gut. And like Asuna predicted, Yuki didn't know that this was a possibility, or even that such a skill existed. And so, having successfully stunned Yuki, Asuna knew that this would be her one and only opportunity, taking this chance to activate the sword skill Quadruple Pain. Had her opponent been anyone but Yuki, she may have won in this moment, but unfortunately for her, Yuki is godlike, parrying every blow of the sword skill on her own unassisted by the system in an amazing feat of skill. Impressed with Asuna, Yuki then decides to finish her with her prized OSS, Mother's Rosario. Asuna does try to the best of her ability to defend against it, but she is utterly outclassed and there is no shame in losing to such an opponent. I love this duel as it features two of my favourite characters, it's beautifully animated in the anime, it showcases some smart tactics from Asuna and excellently displays Yuki's debut as the most skilled character Ayla has ever seen. What more could you honestly want from a fight? Thank you for watching the video. This one was a super fun one to make, but it was also extremely difficult. There are so many good fights in SCO and it felt painful to not include some really good ones, but sadly there are only 5 spots in a top 5 list, so some extremely good fights inevitably have to get cut. I hope you guys found my choices interesting though, and I'm curious to see what your top 5s are. Be sure to make your own rankings and leave them in the comments down below. I'm curious to see how close any of them are to my own rankings, and if not, where do we differ? Did any of you guys manage to guess my entire rankings correctly? I would be really surprised if you did, but hey, leave a comment if you did. Obviously I can't tell if you're telling the truth or not, so I'm just gonna have to trust you to not be a dick. Anyways, please don't forget to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, as I certainly enjoyed making it, and please don't forget to subscribe for more content like this or any of my other interests. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.